Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Dark Whisperer. I know many of you like to use these stories to help you drift off to sleep, so before you get too comfortable, why not take a moment to leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from? I love seeing how far these tales reach across the world. And if you enjoy these eerie stories, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a new episode. All right, let's get cozy, relax, and dive into tonight's chilling tales. Now let's begin. They say that some places hold on to memories longer than others, that the earth itself can absorb the events that transpire there. The Whispering Forest was one of those places. Nestled deep in the heart of the countryside, it had an eerie reputation. For generations, the villagers of Maybrook had warned travelers not to venture into the forest after sunset. Some said the trees were alive, not in the way all trees are, but with something more. Others whispered about those who had gone in and never returned. Jack, however, wasn't from Maybrook. He was just passing through, a young man in his 20s on a road trip, eager for adventure. The stories meant nothing to him. Ghost stories, he thought. Just tales to keep the kids from wandering too far. So, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the cool evening air set in, Jack found himself standing at the edge of the forest, staring into the dense, dark thicket. The path looked innocent enough, just a dirt trail winding into the woods. Jack pulled his jacket tighter around himself as a chill ran down his spine. Still, he was determined to go in. After all, what could possibly go wrong in a quiet, empty forest? With each step, the trees seemed to grow taller, their branches knitting together overhead, forming a canopy that blocked out the last bit of daylight. The wind picked up, whistling through the branches like a faraway voice calling out. Jack smirked to himself. "The Whispering Forest," he muttered. "Right." But as he walked deeper, the forest began to change. At first it was subtle. The leaves underfoot became softer, as though the earth itself was shifting beneath him. The once gentle rustle of the wind became more defined, like words on the tip of a tongue, just out of reach. Jack stopped, listening. It was as if the wind was speaking, but no matter how hard he strained to hear, the words were incomprehensible. He shook his head, laughing nervously. "You're letting the stories get to you, Jack," he muttered under his breath. But the feeling of unease clung to him like the damp air around the trees. Jack quickened his pace. The path, which had been clear and straight, now seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. It felt as though the forest was shifting around him, moving with an unnatural fluidity. He tried to retrace his steps, but the trail had disappeared. Panic began to rise in his chest, and the whispers grew louder. This time, they weren't just wind, they were voices. "Help me," one whispered faintly. "Don't leave me here," came another, barely audible. The voices seemed to be all around him now, weaving through the trees, brushing past him like invisible fingers tugging at his clothes. Jack's heart raced as he spun in circles, searching for the source, but there was no one there. Suddenly, Jack realized he was not alone. Through the corner of his eye, he caught movement, just a shadow darting between the trees. It was quick, too fast for him to see clearly. But as he stood frozen, the shadow appeared again, this time closer. His breath caught in his throat as he felt a presence near him, something watching, waiting. "Who's there?" Jack called out, his voice trembling. But there was no reply, only the growing whispers, more urgent now, like a cacophony of voices overlapping. Some pleaded, some cried, others laughed. A twisted, hollow sound that sent shivers down his spine. Jack started to run. His heart pounded in his chest as he raced down the path, or at least what he thought was the path. The forest was swallowing him whole, trees and shadows blurring together. Every time he thought he had escaped the voices, they would catch up, circling him, taunting him. And then he heard it, a single voice, clear and close. "Turn around." Jack skidded to a stop, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, just a heavy silence pressing down on him. Against his better judgment, Jack slowly turned around. Standing behind him, not 10 feet away, was a figure. It was barely visible in the dim light, but Jack could make out its shape. A tall, gaunt figure draped in tattered clothes, its face hidden in shadow. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but Jack could feel its eyes on him, boring into his soul. For a moment, neither of them moved. Jack wanted to run, to scream, but his legs were rooted to the ground. The figure raised a hand slowly, pointing down the path Jack had just come from. It was then that Jack noticed something strange about the ground beneath the figure's feet. It wasn't standing on solid earth. It seemed to be hovering just above the ground, as if it wasn't part of the world he was in. "Leave," the voice whispered again, louder this time, "before it takes you too." Without thinking, Jack turned and bolted, his legs finally obeying him. He ran faster than he ever had in his life, dodging branches and leaping over roots, not caring where he was going, just needing to escape. Behind him, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the forest itself was trying to pull him back. After what felt like hours, Jack burst through the tree line, stumbling onto the road outside the forest. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his heart still racing. The forest loomed behind him, dark and silent once again, as if nothing had happened. But Jack knew better. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The feeling of eyes on him, the whispers in his ears, they stayed with him long after he left the whispering forest. Jack never spoke of that night again, but whenever he passed through Maybrook, he would drive far out of his way to avoid the forest. Some nights, when the wind was just right, he could still hear it, the voices calling from the trees, waiting for their next visitor. Some say the whispering forest is still there, waiting for the next traveler to wander too far. The voices of those who never returned call out, hoping to lure someone new into the trees. Will you be the next to listen? Now, the next story is about a late-night cab ride that takes a chilling turn. For years, Henry has been a taxi driver, navigating the empty streets long after most people have gone to bed. But one stormy night, he picks up a passenger who is unlike any he's ever encountered. This is the story of the phantom passenger. Henry had been a taxi driver for years, driving through the quiet, winding streets of his small town, usually during the late-night shifts when the roads were empty and his thoughts were his only company. He knew every alleyway, every shortcut, and every hidden corner of the town like the back of his hand. He had seen his fair share of strange passengers over the years, but none of them prepared him for what he would encounter one stormy night in November. It was a night just like any other. The rain had been coming down in sheets since the early evening, and the streets were almost deserted. The heavy sound of rain against his windshield was the only noise breaking the silence as his wipers swiped rhythmically. Henry didn't mind the rain. In fact, he found it comforting on quiet nights like these, where he could focus on the road and his own thoughts. But there was something different about the atmosphere that night. The air felt thicker, almost oppressive, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Henry was about to finish his shift when his radio crackled to life. "Got a fare for you," the dispatcher said, her voice crackling over the static. "Corner of Elm and Sycamore, a woman needs a ride." He glanced at his watch. It was already past midnight. Elm and Sycamore weren't too far, but the area was known to be a bit isolated, especially at this time of night. He hesitated for a moment, but then shrugged. A fare was a fare, after all. With the rain pouring down and few people around, Henry figured the woman would be grateful for the lift. As he drove toward the corner, the streets grew quieter and darker. The few streetlights that lined the road flickered weakly, casting long shadows through the rain. When Henry arrived at the intersection, he didn't see anyone at first. The road was empty, save for the shimmering reflection of the streetlights on the wet pavement. Just as he was about to drive off, thinking the dispatcher must have been mistaken, he spotted her. A woman, standing alone at the edge of the road, completely soaked from the rain. Her long, dark coat clung to her body, and her head was slightly bowed, her wet hair hanging down and obscuring her face. Henry felt a strange chill crawl up his spine, but he pushed it aside. People were often strange during late-night shifts. Henry rolled down the passenger side window just a crack. "Need a ride, miss?" he asked, his voice almost lost in the sound of the rain. The woman didn't reply immediately. She stood there for a moment, her posture stiff, before slowly stepping toward the car. Without saying a word, she opened the back door and climbed into the back seat. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost too smooth, as though she were in no rush at all. "Where to?" Henry asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. But her face was hidden in the shadows, her wet hair still hanging down, making it impossible to see her features clearly. The old bridge. Henry knew the place well. It was on the outskirts of town, isolated and rarely visited except by a few who went there out of curiosity or for solitude. He thought it was a strange request, especially on a night like this, but again, a fare was a fare. As Henry pulled away from the curb and began driving, he glanced at her again in the rearview mirror. She sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead. The rain continued to pour, and the sound of the car's tires splashing through puddles filled the silence. Despite the heater being on, the air inside the car felt cold, too cold, and Henry found himself shivering. Trying to make conversation to ease the growing unease he felt, Henry said, "It's a rough night to be out. What brings you to the old bridge?" The woman didn't respond. She simply stared out the window, watching the rain as it streaked across the glass. Henry felt the silence stretch uncomfortably, but he didn't press her. People could be strange at this time of night, and it wasn't his job to pry. As they drove, Henry became increasingly aware of the cold, the kind of deep cold that seemed to seep into his bones. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and he found himself stealing glances at the woman in the mirror. Her posture hadn't changed, and he could still barely make out her face. It was as if the darkness itself clung to her. After what felt like an eternity, they neared the outskirts of town, where the road led to the old bridge. The rain had eased up slightly, but the night was still oppressively dark. The old bridge came into view, an old, creaky structure over a deep, fast-moving river. The area was surrounded by trees, making it feel even more isolated. Henry slowed the car as they approached the bridge. He looked back at the woman again, but something was different now. She seemed more distant somehow, as if she wasn't entirely there. A deep unease settled in his gut. "We're here," Henry said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. He turned around to address her properly, but his heart froze in his chest. The back seat was empty. There were no wet footprints on the seat, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The only thing left behind was the lingering cold that hung in the air. Henry's mind raced. She couldn't have gotten out without him noticing, but the door hadn't opened, and he hadn't heard a thing. Panic gripped him as he turned back to the front, gripping the wheel tightly. Maybe he had imagined it all. Maybe the long hours in the rain were getting to him. But deep down, Henry knew what he had seen. The woman had been real, hadn't she? Just as he was about to drive away, something caught his eye in the rearview mirror. His heart skipped a beat. There, standing at the edge of the bridge in the pouring rain, was the woman. She was facing away from him, looking out over the water. Slowly, she turned to face him. This time, her face was fully visible, and Henry felt a scream claw its way up his throat. Her eyes were empty, hollow, like two dark voids staring back at him. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips were twisted into a slight, eerie smile. She raised one hand, almost as if waving goodbye, and then she was gone. Henry sat in stunned silence for several moments, his mind unable to process what had just happened. He slammed the car into gear and sped away from the bridge, his heart pounding in his chest. He never spoke of that night, not to his friends, not to his family. But on stormy nights, when the rain beats down on the roof of his cab and the streets are empty, Henry still checks his rearview mirror, half expecting to see her sitting there, waiting for him to take her back to the old bridge. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the rain is especially heavy, he swears he can see her reflection in the glass, watching him, waiting for another ride. Our next story is about a housewarming party that takes a sinister turn. When Lily invites her friends to celebrate her new home, she notices someone in the room who wasn't invited. But it's not just an unwanted guest, it's something much more disturbing. This is the story of the uninvited guest. Lily had always dreamed of owning her own home. After years of saving and working long hours, that dream had finally come true. It was a cozy little house on the outskirts of town, perfect for her. The move-in went smoothly, and soon she was ready to show off her new space. So she decided to throw a housewarming party. The night of the party, Lily's closest friends gathered to celebrate. The house was filled with laughter, conversation, and the clinking of glasses as everyone enjoyed the warmth and comfort of her new home. As the evening went on, people wandered in and out of the different rooms, marveling at the character of the old house with its creaky wooden floors and antique fixtures. The place had charm, a history that Lily loved, even though she didn't know much about it. By midnight, the party was beginning to wind down. A few guests had already left, and those who remained were finishing their drinks and talking in low, relaxed voices. Lily, feeling the weight of the day and the excitement finally catching up to her, decided to step into the kitchen to grab a drink and take a moment to herself. As she poured a glass of water and leaned against the counter, she glanced into the living room where her friends were gathered. That's when she noticed something strange. There, sitting in the corner of the living room, was a man she didn't recognize. He was dressed in a long, dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, watching the other guests with an unsettling stillness. His presence made her feel uneasy immediately. Lily frowned. She knew everyone who had been invited to the party, and she was certain this man was not on the guest list. Maybe he had come with a friend, she thought, but why was he sitting alone, not speaking to anyone? She walked back into the living room, trying to catch the attention of her closest friend, Sarah. When Sarah looked up, Lily motioned toward the corner where the man was sitting. "Hey," Lily whispered to Sarah. "Who is that guy over there? The one in the hat?" Sarah looked over, squinting in the dim light. Then she turned back to Lily, her face confused. "What guy?" Lily's heart skipped a beat. She looked back to the corner. The man was gone. The chair where he had been sitting was empty. "He was just there," Lily said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Sitting right there, I swear. You didn't see him?" Sarah shook her head, laughing nervously. "Lily, I think you've had one too many drinks. There's no one there." But Lily knew what she had seen. The man had been there, sitting silently in the corner, watching. She hadn't imagined it. Her heart began to race as she scanned the room, but there was no sign of the stranger. The rest of the party passed in a blur. Lily couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered long after the last guest had left. She locked the doors and turned off the lights, but as she stood at the bottom of the stairs, ready to go to bed, she couldn't help but glance back into the living room. The corner where the man had been sitting looked darker than the rest of the room, like a shadow that refused to lift. That night, Lily tossed and turned in bed, her mind replaying the events of the evening. Had she really seen someone? Or had her exhaustion gotten the better of her? She tried to convince herself that it had been a trick of the light, that she was just tired and imagining things. But as the hours passed, sleep didn't come. At around 3 a.m., just as she was finally beginning to doze off, Lily woke with a start. Her bedroom was silent, but something had pulled her from the edge of sleep. It was a feeling, like someone was in the room with her, standing just out of sight. She lay still, her heart pounding in her chest, listening for any sign of movement. There was nothing. The air felt heavy, as though it had thickened around her, pressing down on her chest. She forced herself to sit up, her eyes scanning the room. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting faint shadows across the floor, but there was no one there. And then she heard it. A soft creak, like the sound of a floorboard shifting under someone's weight. It was faint, barely audible, but it came from the hallway just outside her bedroom door. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She listened, her pulse racing. Another creak, closer this time. Someone or something was in the house. Slowly, she reached for her phone on the nightstand, but as her fingers brushed the screen, the phone slipped from her grasp and fell to the floor with a dull thud. The sound seemed to echo in the silence. Her bedroom door, which had been slightly ajar, slowly began to swing open. Lily froze. her eyes locked on the door as it creaked open inch by inch. Her mouth went dry as she waited, expecting to see someone step into the room, but no one did. The door swung open fully, revealing the dark, empty hallway beyond. And then she saw him. Standing at the far end of the hallway was the man from the party. His long coat seemed to blend with the shadows, and his face was still obscured by that wide-brimmed hat. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, watching her. Lily's body went cold. She wanted to scream, to run, but her voice was caught in her throat, and her legs felt like lead. The man slowly raised his hand, pointing directly at her. His movements were slow, deliberate, and impossibly smooth. "Who are you?" Lily whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. The man said nothing. He remained completely still, his finger still pointing at her. For what felt like an eternity, they stared at each other, neither of them moving. And then, as quickly as he had appeared, the man was gone. Lily blinked, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway was empty. The door to her bedroom was wide open, but there was no sign of the man. Had she imagined the whole thing? Was her mind playing tricks on her? She jumped out of bed, grabbed her phone from the floor, and turned on all the lights in the house. She searched every room, every corner, but there was no one there. She was alone. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and fear. Lily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every shadow seemed darker. Every creak of the house felt like footsteps. She tried to go about her normal routine, but her nerves were shot. She barely slept, and when she did, she was plagued by nightmares of the man standing at the end of her hallway, pointing at her with that eerily smooth motion. She told Sarah about what had happened, but Sarah just laughed it off, telling Lily that the stress of moving into a new house was getting to her. But Lily knew better. She hadn't imagined the man. He had been there, in her house, watching her. A week after the party, things reached a breaking point. Lily was sitting in her living room, trying to read a book and calm her nerves, when she heard the familiar creak of the floorboards. It was the same sound she had heard the night after the party, the sound of someone walking through her hallway. Slowly she stood up, her heart racing, and walked toward the hallway. As she stepped into the dimly lit corridor, she saw it again, the man in the coat and hat, standing at the far end, just as he had before. This time, though, something was different. His hat was tilted slightly upward, revealing his face. Lily's blood ran cold. His face was pale, almost ghostly white, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. His lips were curled into a small, unsettling smile, as though he knew something she didn't. He raised his hand once more, pointing at her, his finger trembling slightly. Lily backed away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She turned and ran out of the house, not stopping until she was standing on the sidewalk staring at her own front door. The house was silent, but she could feel his presence, lingering just beyond the door. Lily couldn't stay in the house any longer. She packed a bag and left, staying with Sarah for a few nights. She wanted to sell the house to get as far away from it as possible, but something drew her back. She couldn't explain it, but she felt as though the house was calling to her. A few nights later, she returned to gather more of her belongings. The house was dark and cold, the way it always felt now. She moved quickly, not wanting to linger longer than necessary. But as she reached for the light switch in the hallway, she stopped. The man was standing there again, at the end of the hallway, just as he had before. But this time, he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was another figure, a woman dressed in a long, flowing gown, her face just as pale and ghostly as his. The two of them stood there, side by side, watching her. Lily didn't wait to see what they wanted. She turned and ran, slamming the front door behind her as she fled into the night. Her heart was pounding, and her breath came in ragged gasps as she ran to her car, not daring to look back. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking, before finally starting the engine and speeding away. She didn't stop until she was far from the house, pulling over on the side of the road, trying to calm herself. Her mind raced with questions. Who were they? Why were they in her house? And why did they keep appearing, watching her in silence? For a few moments, she sat in her car, clutching the steering wheel, trying to make sense of it all. But deep down, Lily knew that the answers wouldn't come easily. Determined to uncover the truth, Lily decided to dig deeper into the history of the house. She visited the local library the next day, poring over old records and news articles, hoping to find some clue about the strange figures that haunted her. After hours of searching, she found it. An old newspaper article from decades ago detailed a tragedy that had occurred in the very house Lily now owned. A man and a woman, a married couple, had lived there in the early 1900s. According to the report, the couple had been deeply in love, but their relationship had grown strained over time. The man had become reclusive, refusing to leave the house, while the woman had tried to carry on with her life. One stormy night, the neighbors heard screams coming from the house. By the time they arrived, it was too late. The woman had been found dead at the bottom of the staircase, her neck broken. The man had vanished without a trace. His disappearance had remained a mystery, with many speculating that he had either taken his own life or disappeared into the woods surrounding the town. Neither his body nor any trace of him was ever found. Lily's blood ran cold as she read the final lines of the article. Local legend claims that the spirits of the couple still linger in the house, trapped in a restless purgatory, doomed to replay the night of the tragedy. Visitors to the home have reported sightings of a man in a long coat and a woman in a gown, standing side by side, watching silently from the shadows. It all made sense now. The figures she had seen were the spirits of the couple, still bound to the house after all these years. That night, Lily couldn't stop thinking about the tragedy. She felt a deep sense of dread, knowing that the couple's spirits were trapped in her home, reliving their final moments over and over again. But she couldn't leave it like that. She had to know what they wanted, why they kept appearing to her. Against her better judgment, Lily returned to the house one last time. The air was thick with tension as she stepped inside, the shadows seeming to close in around her. She called out, her voice trembling, "What do you want? Why are you here?" For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a soft creaking sound echoed through the hallway, the same sound she had heard that night after the party. Slowly, Lily turned to face the end of the hallway. The man and the woman were standing there, just as they had before. But this time, there was something different about them. Their expressions were no longer cold and distant. The woman's face was filled with sorrow, her eyes wide with grief. The man's hand, which had always pointed at her with a sense of menace, now seemed to tremble with regret. They weren't here to harm her. They were trapped, bound to the house by their own unfinished business. The weight of their tragedy hung heavy in the air. Lily took a deep breath, her fear replaced by a strange sense of calm. "You can let go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You don't have to stay here anymore." For a moment, the spirits didn't move, but then, slowly, the woman's hand reached out, gently touching the man's arm. Their gazes locked, and a wave of emotion passed between them. Love, regret, sorrow. The man lowered his arm, and the tension in the air seemed to lift. Without a word, the two figures turned and began to fade, their forms dissolving into the shadows as they slowly disappeared from sight. Lily stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where they had been. The house was quiet now, the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over it for so long finally gone. In the weeks that followed, Lily stayed in the house, no longer afraid of the shadows that once haunted her. The spirits were gone, their presence no longer felt within the walls. The house felt lighter, as though a great burden had been lifted. Lily knew she had done the right thing by facing them, by helping them find peace after so many years of being trapped. But every now and then, late at night, when the wind howled through the trees outside, she would glance toward the corner of the living room, half expecting to see the man and the woman standing there once more. But they never came back. The uninvited guests had finally left, and Lily's home was her own again. Or at least, that's what she told herself. Because sometimes, in the stillness of the night, she could still feel it. The faintest hint of a presence lingering just beyond the edge of her awareness, as if the house itself remembered the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. And while the spirits may have found peace, the house itself would never forget. Our next story takes us down a dark and isolated road, one that isn't on any map and seems to have a mind of its own. A long-haul truck driver, lost in the middle of nowhere, finds himself on a path that may never let him leave. This is the unsettling tale of the vanishing road. It was late one summer evening when Mike, a long-haul truck driver, found himself on an unfamiliar road deep in the countryside. His GPS had malfunctioned hours ago, and despite his best efforts to find a familiar route, every turn seemed to lead him deeper into nowhere. His destination was still several hours away, and the empty road stretched ahead in eerie silence, bordered by dense forests on either side. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in a deep indigo, and soon only the weak beams of his truck's headlights cut through the growing darkness. Mike had driven through lonely stretches of highway before, but this road was different. The trees seemed too close, almost suffocating, as if the forest was pressing in on the road itself. And the road, something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong. As the minutes passed, Mike's unease grew. The road felt endless, winding through the woods with no signs, no lights, and no other cars. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the darkness, searching for anything, any indication of where he was. Then, out of nowhere, he saw it. A figure, standing on the side of the road, just beyond the reach of his headlights. At first, Mike thought it was a hitchhiker, but as he drew closer, his stomach dropped. The figure wasn't moving. It stood perfectly still, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned suit. The man's head was tilted downward, his face obscured by shadows. Something about the way he stood, so rigid, so unnatural, sent a chill down Mike's spine. He passed the figure without slowing down, glancing in his rearview mirror. But as his truck roared by, the man didn't even flinch. He remained frozen on the side of the road, like a statue carved out of the night. Mike shuddered and kept driving, but a sense of unease lingered. The road felt wrong, like it was leading him somewhere he wasn't supposed to go. His truck's radio crackled with static, and for the first time in years of driving, Mike felt truly lost. The dark forest closed in around him, and the road seemed narrower, as if it was trying to trap him. 15 minutes passed, then 30, and Mike still hadn't seen another car or any sign of life. His headlights illuminated only the endless trees and the twisting road ahead. He was about to pull over and try to recalibrate his GPS when something up ahead caught his attention. A gas station. Relief washed over him. It looked run down, but the flickering light from the station's sign was a beacon in the overwhelming darkness. He pulled into the lot, his tires crunching over the gravel, and cut the engine. The station was eerily quiet, and the single gas pump looked like it hadn't been used in years. Still, he figured he could at least ask for directions. Mike climbed out of the cab, stretching his stiff legs, and walked toward the small convenience store attached to the station. The windows were grimy, and the dim light from inside barely penetrated the thick glass. He pushed the door open, and a bell jingled weakly as he stepped inside. The interior was just as dilapidated as the outside. Dust covered the shelves, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. At the counter, an old man sat hunched over, staring at a small black and white television that flickered with static. "Evening," Mike said, trying to sound casual. "I think I'm lost. Can you tell me where this road leads?" The old man didn't respond at first. He didn't even look up from the television. Mike felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Something was wrong. "Sir?" Mike prompted, stepping closer to the counter. The man's eyes slowly lifted from the screen, and Mike recoiled slightly. The man's gaze was empty, like he wasn't really seeing him. "This road," the old man said, his voice low and raspy, "leads nowhere you want to go." Mike blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "What do you mean?" The old man turned back to his television, as if the conversation was over. Mike's unease deepened. He glanced around the store, noting how everything seemed frozen in time, as though it had been abandoned for years but never touched. Suddenly, a faint noise echoed from outside, a soft, distant hum. Mike stepped to the window and peered out into the night. For a moment, he thought he saw movement in the trees, a flicker of shadow darting between the trunks. He strained his eyes, but the forest beyond the gas station remained still, silent. "I need to get back to the main highway." Mike said, turning back to the old man. "Can you point me in the right direction?" The man finally looked at him again, his eyes narrowing. "You're on the wrong road," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "This road, it doesn't let you leave." A chill crawled up Mike's spine. "What are you talking about?" But the old man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly rose from his chair and shuffled toward the back of the store, disappearing into the shadows without another word. Mike's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't wait around to figure out what was going on. He hurried back to his truck, the eerie silence of the night pressing in on him. The moment he climbed into the cab and started the engine, a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He needed to get out of there, fast. As he pulled back onto the road, his headlights swept across the forest. For a split second, Mike thought he saw something, a figure moving among the trees. But it was gone before he could get a clear look. His truck rumbled down the narrow road, the darkness closing in around him once again. He drove faster, desperate to find a way out. But the road twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, like it was leading him in circles. The trees seemed closer now, their branches reaching toward him like claws. And then, in the distance, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Standing on the side of the road, just beyond the reach of his headlights, was the same man he had seen earlier, the man in the old-fashioned suit, his head tilted downward, his body unnaturally still. Mike's hands tightened on the wheel as he sped past, but this time he didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. He didn't need to. He could feel the man watching him. The road stretched on, endless and unforgiving. And as the night wore on, Mike began to realize the terrible truth. The old man was right. This road wasn't going to let him leave. And somewhere deep in the woods, something was waiting for him. Something that had been waiting for a very long time. Our next tale takes us deep into the woods, where a group of friends on a simple road trip stumbles upon a village that time forgot. But this village holds dark secrets, and what starts as a search for directions quickly turns into a fight for survival. Get ready for a chilling tale of isolation and fear. This is the Forgotten Village. It was supposed to be a straightforward trip. Emily and her two closest friends, Jake and Hannah, had planned a weekend getaway to the mountains, a chance to escape the hustle of the city, breathe fresh air, and disconnect from the stress of their daily lives. They'd booked a cabin, packed their bags, and left early Friday morning to make the most of their weekend retreat. But what started as a simple road trip turned into something far more sinister. The first signs of trouble appeared early in the afternoon. They'd been driving for hours along a scenic mountain road, with the sun high in the sky and not a cloud in sight. Jake was at the wheel, as usual, while Hannah sat in the passenger seat, fiddling with the playlist. Emily, stretched out in the back seat, was enjoying the view of towering pines and distant peaks when the car's GPS suddenly lost signal. "Looks like we're going off-grid," Jake said with a grin, tapping the device. "No GPS, no worries, I've got this." Hannah rolled her eyes. "Famous last words, Jake." "Don't worry, we're close," Emily said, pulling out her phone to check the map. But her screen showed no signal either. "Huh, that's weird." Jake took a wrong turn shortly after that, insisting it would be a shortcut to the cabin. At first, no one questioned it. The new road was narrow and winding, but it still cut through the beautiful forest, and the sense of adventure kept them in high spirits. But as the hours passed, the mood in the car shifted from excitement to unease. The trees became denser, the road more treacherous, and soon they hadn't seen another car in what felt like forever. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows over the road, and the deeper they drove into the forest, the more disoriented they became. "This can't be right," Hannah muttered, glancing at the clock on the dashboard. "We should have reached the cabin by now." Emily leaned forward, peering out the windshield. "Jake, are you sure you know where we are?" Jake, looking less confident than before, shrugged. "I swear, this road leads back to the highway. I'm sure of it. We just need to keep going." But the deeper they drove, the more the forest seemed to close in around them. The towering pines loomed over the road like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in the cool evening breeze. The once cheerful atmosphere inside the car had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The last rays of sunlight faded, and night fell quickly, plunging the road into darkness. The headlights of Jake's car barely penetrated the thick canopy above, casting eerie shadows on the winding path ahead. No one spoke, each of them feeling the mounting tension. Just when Emily was about to suggest they turn around, a small sign appeared by the side of the road. It was old, nearly covered in moss, and the paint was peeling, but they could just make out the word, Cedar Hollow. Cedar Hollow? Hannah asked, her voice low. Is that the name of a town? Jake frowned. I've never heard of it, but maybe we should check it out. If there's a town nearby, we can ask for directions. Emily didn't like the idea, but she could tell from the strained silence that neither of them had any better options. All right, she said reluctantly. Let's see what Cedar Hollow is. They turned onto the narrow road leading toward the village, the car's tires crunching over gravel. The road twisted and turned, growing narrower and more overgrown with each passing mile. The forest seemed to press in closer, the trees crowding the edges of the road like silent onlookers. It wasn't long before they saw the first signs of life, or what had once been life. The village of Cedar Hollow emerged from the darkness like a forgotten memory. The houses were small and wooden, their roofs sagging under the weight of time. Weeds and vines crawled up the sides of buildings, choking the windows and doorways. The streets were deserted, and there wasn't a single light on in any of the homes. Are we sure this place isn't abandoned? Emily asked, her voice tinged with unease. Jake slowed the car to a crawl, his eyes scanning the darkened buildings. It doesn't look like anyone's lived here in a while, but there has to be someone around. Maybe there's a general store or something. The car rolled to a stop in what seemed to be the center of town. A dilapidated sign hung above what might have once been a town hall, its paint faded and the words barely legible. A small fountain, now dry and cracked, stood in the middle of the square, its stone figures worn down by years of neglect. This place is seriously creepy, Hannah whispered, her eyes wide as she looked around. Why would anyone live out here? Jake turned off the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the eerie stillness of the village. We'll just take a quick look around, see if there's anyone who can help us. If not, we'll head back the way we came. The three of them stepped out of the car, the cold night air immediately biting at their skin. The wind rustled through the trees, sending a shiver down Emily's spine. She glanced around, feeling the weight of the village's silence pressing in on her. As they walked down the main street, the sound of their footsteps echoed off the empty buildings. Every house they passed looked abandoned, windows boarded up, doors hanging off their hinges. There were no signs of life, no lights, no voices, nothing. This doesn't feel right, Emily muttered, wrapping her arms around herself as they passed a particularly run-down house. The door was slightly ajar, and she swore she saw movement inside, but when she looked closer, it was just the wind stirring a faded curtain. We should leave, Hannah said, her voice barely above a whisper. This place, it feels wrong. Jake didn't respond. He was standing in front of what appeared to be the town's only store, its sign swinging lazily in the wind. The windows were dark and the door was locked, but something about the building drew them in. Let's just check this place out, Jake said, stepping up to the porch. Maybe someone left a map inside, or some supplies. Emily and Hannah exchanged uneasy glances but followed Jake up to the door. He pushed it open with a creak, and the smell of damp wood and dust greeted them. Inside, the store was as abandoned as the rest of the village. Shelves stood half empty, covered in cobwebs, and the floorboards groaned under their weight as they walked further inside. A single lantern hung from the ceiling, its glass cracked and dirty, casting a dim glow over the room. This place is ancient, Hannah muttered, running her fingers along a shelf that held cans of food so old the labels had worn off. I don't think anyone's been here in decades. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, a soft, shuffling sound coming from the back of the store. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Did you hear that? Jake nodded, his eyes narrowing as he moved toward the source of the sound. Maybe it's an animal. But Emily wasn't convinced. The sound wasn't like any animal she'd ever heard. It was slow, deliberate, like someone or something was moving just out of sight. Jake, don't, Hannah warned, but he was already making his way toward the back room. Emily followed cautiously, her heart racing in her chest. The back room was darker than the rest of the store, and the smell of decay was stronger here. Old crates and barrels were stacked against the walls, and the floor was littered with debris. The shuffling noise came again, louder this time and closer. Jake froze, his hand resting on the handle of the door that led to the back alley. "Whatever it is, it's back here." He slowly pushed the door open, revealing the dark alley behind the store. The wind howled through the narrow passage, sending a chill through Emily's bones. She peered over Jake's shoulder, half expecting to see some wild animal dart out from the shadows. But there was nothing. The alley was empty, save for a few broken crates and trash scattered along the ground. "I told you it's nothing," Jake said, his voice low. But Emily wasn't so sure. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something or someone was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the alley. They weren't alone. Before anyone could react, a figure stepped out from the shadows at the far end of the alley. It was a man, tall and thin, his clothes tattered and worn. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and dark, and his skin looked as if it hadn't seen sunlight in years. He moved slowly, his feet dragging across the ground as he approached them. Who are you?" Jake called out, taking a step back. The man didn't answer. He just kept moving toward them, his eyes fixed on the three of them, his expression blank. "Stay back," Hannah warned, her voice trembling. But the man didn't stop. He kept coming closer, his movements unnaturally slow as if each step was a struggle. "What do you want?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. The man finally stopped a few feet away from them, his eyes flicking between each of them before settling on Emily. His lips parted, and in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he said, "You shouldn't be here." Jake, Hannah, and Emily exchanged nervous glances. "We're just lost," Jake said quickly. "We didn't mean to trespass. We're looking for directions." The man didn't seem to hear him. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't have come here," he repeated. "You need to leave now." A shiver ran down Emily's spine. There was something wrong with this man, something unnatural. His voice, his movements, even the way he looked at them, as if he was seeing something that wasn't there. "We'll go," Jake said, his voice firm. "We'll leave right now." The man took a step back, his hollow eyes never leaving Emily. "It's too late." Without another word, he turned and disappeared back into the shadows of the alley. For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with tension, and Emily could hear her heart pounding in her ears. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice low and urgent. Hannah didn't argue. She was already heading back toward the car, her footsteps quick and nervous. Emily followed close behind, her mind racing with questions. Who was that man? Why did he look like he hadn't seen another person in years? And what did he mean by, "It's too late"? As they hurried back to the car, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the man standing in the shadows, but there was no one there. By the time they reached the car, Hannah was already in the passenger seat, her hands trembling as she fumbled with her seatbelt. Jake jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine. "We're leaving," he said, his voice tense. "I don't care how long it takes, we're getting out of here." Emily climbed into the back seat, her eyes scanning the darkened village one last time as they pulled away. The houses, the empty streets, the eerie silence. It all felt like a bad dream, one that she couldn't wake up from. As they drove down the narrow road that led out of Cedar Hollow, the village quickly disappeared into the darkness behind them. But even as the trees closed in once more and the road twisted and turned, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't really leaving, that something had followed them. They drove for hours, winding through the dense forest, the road seeming to stretch on forever. But no matter how far they went, no matter how fast they drove, the road never seemed to end. Emily stared out the window, her eyes growing heavy with exhaustion. She could see nothing but trees, endless trees that towered over them, their branches swaying in the wind. The car's headlights barely penetrated the darkness, and every shadow seemed to shift and move as they passed. "Where are we?" Hannah whispered, her voice tight with fear. We've been driving for hours, and we're still not out of the forest. I don't know, Jake said, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. It doesn't make sense. We should have hit the highway by now. Emily glanced at the GPS, but it was still frozen, the screen blank. Her phone had no signal, and neither did Hannah's. We're trapped, Emily thought, her chest tightening with fear. We can't leave. Just then, the car hit something in the road, a loud thump that shook the entire vehicle. Jake slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. "What was that?" Hannah cried, her voice high-pitched. Jake cursed under his breath, throwing the car into park and opening the door. "I'll check it out." He stepped out of the car and walked toward the front, disappearing into the darkness. Emily and Hannah exchanged worried glances, their hearts racing. Minutes passed and Jake didn't return. "Jake," Emily called, leaning out of the window. "What's going on?" There was no answer. "Jake?" Hannah shouted, her voice trembling with panic. "This isn't funny." Emily's blood ran cold as the silence dragged on. She opened her door and stepped out of the car, her breath fogging in the cold night air. The trees rustled in the wind, casting long, shifting shadows across the road. "Jake," Emily called again, her voice barely more than a whisper. And then she saw it. Standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the car's headlights, was the man from Cedar Hollow. His hollow eyes locked onto Emily's, and his lips curled into a twisted smile. Behind him, lying motionless on the road, was Jake. Emily's scream echoed through the forest.